The gist of a wire transfer is that you gather a lot of information up front from the receiver and related to the sender. You put all that information in, usually to like your Fedwire type system in a basic domestic wire transfer request.
Mark, I wanted to ask you some questions about wire transfers. So, first of all, let's start with the basics. What are the fundamental components that make up the wire transfer system?
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's a great question. So wire transfers have been around for a while, actually. And if we go back to like old school Western Union, that's kind of where they all originated from. But the idea behind a wire transfer is really the payment certainty side of things. So it's all about credit push transactions. You have your senders and your receivers, you have your financial institutions involved. But the gist of a wire transfer is that you gather a lot of information up front from the receiver and related to the sender. You put all that information in, usually to like your Fedwire type system in a basic domestic wire transfer request. And then there is a guaranteed degree of certainty associated with the wire transfer, although it's not like an instant payment where it happens within seconds, but it does get to the receiving party relatively quickly, all depending in your processing time frame. So it's really good for like those high value transactions that you want a lot of security and payment certainty associated with them. There's obviously a lot of fraud that happens on the wire front too, and that's why you see all these disclosures out there. We won't email you any wire transfer change information. You have to call us every time you need to validate. There's a lot of steps in place to secure that because of the irrevocable nature of them. So once those funds have been wired out, they're gone. But that's why it's a beneficial transaction. So if I'm closing on a house, I want to make sure my down payment and my closing fees get there on time. I know that if I do the wire transfer first thing in the morning, and it gets through the validation process, it's going to get to the receiver in time, and I'm not going to have to worry about anything as long as I did everything correctly.
So, Mark, how do the wire transfers differ from other forms of electronic payments in terms of use and importance? Like, when would we use one over the other?
So in old school, you would think of it as wire transfers were like your high value transactions but low volume. ACH tended to be lower value but high volume transactions. Checks obviously have never gone away. Checks just continue to be used. And then your card transactions are more for those day-to-day type transactions. So the way I look at it, those characteristics have not changed drastically over time, although ACH is being used now for larger dollar payments in addition to the smaller ones. But the big difference here is that ACH you can use for debit pulling or credit push, so you can do credits and debits on the network. Cards are really specific to those different types of transactions. You're going in, I'm pushing you out the credit based on that debit pull transaction. I'm purchasing a coffee or so on. And then your wire transfers, though, really historically were related to the payment certainty aspect because they are credit push only. But they really typically are higher dollar transactions because they're more expensive. They're probably one of the most expensive payment mechanisms that exist out there today. And then instant payments have kind of changed everything because they kind of operate like a wire transfer, but they're much faster because it's happening all instantaneously. And then the settlement is all happening instantaneously as well. But instant payments kind of are a game changer. And we haven't really seen exactly what that means for the other payment systems yet.
Well, it's funny. My next question, I think, is going to go back to something you said the last question when you talked about fraud a little bit. But what operational challenges do FIs have? What do they face when they're executing wire transfers? What kind of challenges do they have?
So that's like a twofold question. So you have the sending side of it, and then you have the receiving side of it. So from a sending side, there's a lot of risk on the fraud front. So, Patty, if you have a romance scam where you think that you're going to marry so-and-so in a foreign country, and he asked you to send all of your money to him so that he can come and live here with you for the rest of your life, that's a big challenge for the sending side of things.
I thought we were keeping that confidential between you and I.
That's a big challenge because you have the potential of what does the financial institution do?
Right.
So I always tell institutions, you have the right to refuse it. You can't stop them from using their money. You just don't have to necessarily be a party to their transaction. So if they insist on doing a wire transfer and you're like, we're not going to do it, cut them a check or do whatever you're going to do, or let them take the funds out of the account. Make sure it's really clear that you fully educated them on whatever it is that you think is going on. But they have the risk there that they could be a party to sending transactions that are fraudulent. And then at that point, what happens on the receiver side of things, or the what happens with the sender of those funds? How do they reconcile that? Obviously, if you have them sign off and say that it's their liability, yes, it's their liability, but you also have the reputational challenges there. What if that person goes out to the media and starts saying, well, my bank, let me send this wire transfer, I lost my entire life savings, and they're not doing anything for me? Yeah, you may not be liable for that, but that's a big reputational issue for you. What are you going to do to remediate that? So that's part of it. So having the control structure in place to validate the wire transfer requests, making sure that the sender of those funds understands that these are irrevocable transactions, that the intent of them makes sense, that they are actually sending it to a party that they are supposed to send it to. All those things have to come into play on the sending side. The receiving side isn't completely passive in all of this either. So they have the challenges of posting those transactions when they receive them. Now, one of the benefits under UCC and Reg J is the idea of posting by account number only. So if I receive those funds, I can post it based on account number only. Although, if I have a red flag trigger, there could be potential issues there if I think that these funds didn't really belong to Patty when they came in. So I do need to act upon that, but I do have some regulatory protection. There's also agreement requirements that you need to think about there too. And these are all things that we do dive into deeper when we do our educational sessions. But the other side of it, though, is the exception side. So what do I do if something's slightly off? If the account number came in 12345 for Patty Presta, but it's actually 12345 6, do I make an exception and actually post that? Well, if I do that, I'm actually not protected because I've changed and altered that account number. What happens now if the other institution says, hey, something happened here and it should have actually been returned, not posted? Then the receiving institution can run into some potential challenges there. So it's all about the validation practices and making sure you have a strong operational structure in place in how you handle exceptions, how you handle the vetting process. And that's why having education on this front is really critical.
Yeah, I've had a handful of members who have turned away an elderly customer that wanted to wire a very large amount of money to another country. And they said, we just can't, in good faith, do this. So
Yep.
you might want to go to another bank. And that's really tough to do. But when you know that this is something that's going to end badly, they just said we couldn't do it.
It's better to not be a party to it. I know it's hard because it's your customer member. You don't want to upset them, but it's way better to not be a party to the transaction because guaranteed that, 2 months later, that person's going to come back and say, I was scammed.
Yep. Yeah. So, Mark, how do wire transfer fees impact a bank or credit union's decision making for their businesses and consumers?
So wire transfers are more expensive just by the nature of the transactions. So typically there are higher fee structures in place, both on the consumer and business side. So it really depends on the use case. So, and your customers and members really drive use cases. So if I come in and I'm a consumer and I need to send funds overseas because I have my child is attending school in Great Britain and I have to wire the funds over there in order to cover their tuition costs. That's a use case where a very common one where consumers would likely use a wire transfer, even though it's more expensive because they want the payment guarantee. They want to know it's going to actually make it there. And they want to make sure that the high dollar funds have been secured a little bit. So I'm not probably going to do like an ACH transaction for that. Definitely probably not going to do a check. With your businesses, they tend to use those for the high value transactions as well. So if they have invoice payments that they owe to vendors, they're likely going to use probably wire transfers unless they're going to set up like on an automatic ACH debit. But it all depends too on the relationship that they have with their other third parties. So maybe they only accept payments as wire transfers. Your businesses are probably more accepting of the wire transfer fees as well. Businesses, and as a general rule, are more forgiving when it comes to paying fees for these different types of transactions than your consumers. So your consumers are going to really want to make sure that it's a very specific use case that they're following. So the financial institution really needs to include wire transfers in their suite of services, because there's definitely going to be cases for businesses and consumers to use them. It's just that you're probably not going to be able to sway my decision to use ACH versus wire. That's really going to be driven by my needs as your customer or member.
And I think definitely it goes back to the olden days where an institution didn't offer ACH services or ACH origination, they're going to go somewhere else. And it's the same with
Exactly.
the wires. So, what are the security measures in place to ensure that the integrity of those wire transfers? I know there's regulatory agencies that look at that, right?
Absolutely. And it's a huge consideration. So your UCC 4A addresses wholesale transactions, which are going to be your wire transfers. It also includes some cases for ACH, but wires are a big part of that. And some of the things that, especially from a business perspective, that you have as requirements as a financial institution is the commercially reasonable security procedures in place. So you need to make sure that as a financial institution, you're implementing a control structure that ensures that wire transfers are not going out that shouldn't go out. Meaning fraud cases of fraud, you need to have validation practices in place, because it is very likely that if you don't do those security measures, your institution could potentially be held liable for that. And the other thing to keep in mind with commercially reasonable standards is it's a measure of law. So it's not going to be a standardized practice. It's all based on the size and complexity of your organization. It also depends on your customers, their size and complexity, in addition to what your competition or your similar institutions look like. So there's a lot of different factors there. But if you go into a court, are your practices going to be deemed to be commercially reasonable? Did you implement security procedures to validate these wire transfers that are going out of your institution? If not, you could be held liable, even though there are no consumer protections for businesses. That's kind of a fake thing that we think in the industry, because there is protections for businesses. They're just under UCC 4A. So to your points, Patty, we really do need to make sure there is adequate control structure in place to validate wire transfer requests, to make sure the correct parties are logging in and gaining access to initiating those transfers, and that when we receive them as an institution, we're not passive with that we actually take the time to fully validate and ensure that we're sending out something that should go out.
So that brings me to, we're talking a lot about fraud, which is kind of hard not to, right?
Yeah.
What role do we each play in addressing in these challenges that we have, would you say?
Absolutely. So we take it from multiple stances. So obviously there's the operational compliance considerations. So how do you actually just logistically do this? What are all your requirements? How do you dive into UCC 4A and understand what it means for your institution and how you implement these different programs? So we're a partner in that respect, because we do offer educational courses, different information that we put out there. I know Mary Mumper Morrison on our team has built resources related to wire transfers just to try and digest this information for our members. So we're a partner in that respect, because we try to take all this information and make it something that our members can make sense of. And then because these are high risk transactions, they can cause high losses to our members as well. It's critical for us to also help on the front as far as what are the different fraud schemes going on? What do you need to know about that? So that's another big component about what we do from an education and advocacy perspective. We not only create educational sessions where we dive into those fraud implications and what they mean to you, but we also engage like through our fraud committee, where you can actively be a part of the discussions happening, where you can figure out what other institutions are seeing, what you're seeing, share and work as a community to really solve these problems. Because when it comes to fraud, we can't be competitors. We need to be working collaboratively and cooperatively to solve these problems that are happening in the industry.
Very good. Thank you. You're giving me a lot of good things to think about. So, are there any technological advancements or any best practices that have improved wire transfers in the last, I mean, the last thing I can think of is really back, oh God, years ago with the remittance transfers, we embellished a lot of the security that we did. But can you think of anything else?
I absolutely can. So, and I'm not being a proponent of any specific solution here, but Fiserv, when they came out with wire exchange, and there's other systems that are very similar to that, but that's kind of the gold standard right now, is a great technological implementation that came out. So, what it does is it integrates in a complete wire hub. And they've actually expanded it because now it does instant payments as well. But the idea behind it was that you would have all the requirements associated with the wire transfer. So different fields that need to be included, any updates to different sanction lists, anything that you need to know in order to send a wire transfer to China, it would in real time update to make sure that you're including all of the relevant information related to that. It ensures a nice degree of security for the financial institution in making sure that the wire is accurate, but also including different levels of control when it comes to, Patty can enter this wire into the system and then Mark can approve it, but maybe Mark can only approve it up to 150,000. And then it needs to go to Mary because she's going to approve anything above and beyond that. So these nice control structures really help us avoid some of the challenges that we had with wires going out the door without going through validation practices, without the correct information, and then coming back and fees were taken out, or institutions taking losses. So that's one example of technological advancement. We also have in next year, and they pushed it back a couple times, but I do think it's going to happen in 2025, is the ISO 20022 data adoption. So the information associated with wires going through the FedWire system, just like instant payments through FedNow and through the RTP network, are going to adopt the ISO data standard. So the fields will be very similar to what you see in these other payment networks. That's going to create a lot of efficiency when we think about overall payment systems, because now we have all these different payment networks operating in the same format. The information can be used and brought into other systems. It can create operational efficiencies. It creates a lot of data richness too. We're able to see a lot more information, both from the sender and receiver perspective, but also from the financial institution perspective. If I'm doing monitoring or I need to get analytics associated to the activity, I'm able to pull a lot more information out from these different transactions and have that be much more usable. So to your point, I do think the ISO 20022 data adoption in 2025 will be a huge modernizing factor for wires.
Thank you, Brian. Mark, I have one more question because I think we have a little bit of time. Looking ahead, how do you envision the future of wire transfers in the financial ecosystem? Kind of asked you the same question when it came to ACH.
Yeah, so I think it's going to be interesting. So you have obviously your instant payment rails that offer similar functionality to wire transfers. I'm able to do a transaction, a credit push transaction, and it goes out pretty instantaneously. The difference, a big difference between wire transfers and instant payments is the validation practices. So for me to be able to do an instant payment, I just need the account number and the routing number, and then it's gone. And it's irrevocable too, just like a wire transfer. But with a wire transfer, I need to give a lot more information about the receiver of that transaction. There's a lot more validation and control that goes into that. It is fast, but it's not as fast as an instant payment. So I guess I'll repeat my same spiel, is that I think it's probably all use case driven. So, which I don't think is driven by the financial institution, by the way. I think use cases are driven by the end users. It's the
I
people
agree.
that
Yeah.
you do business with. Your customers and members are the ones that are going to drive what the use cases become. So to that end, you're going to have ACH transaction use cases. You're going to have wire transfer use cases. You're going to have instant payment use cases as well. What I think will be interesting with the way that this all kind of shakes out is how does it kind of migrate? So do I have wire transfer use cases today that are going to migrate to instant payments because maybe I don't care about the degree of payment certainty associated with the validation practices, or maybe I don't want to enter all that information in. I just want to put Patty's bank account number and her routing number in, and it's gone and it went over to her. So I do think there'll be some migration over there, which I know is kind of concerning because there's the fee income aspect of it as well.
Right.
But I think that's where our industry is going, is that we have these new payment mechanisms. We kind of have to see how it all shakes out.
Well, I was going to say, yeah, I can see where maybe wire volume would go down.
Mhm.
However, there is still a high, I mean, we can send more money through a wire than we can currently with, say, FedNow. So they're like Boeing, FedNow's not going to help them. They still going to need that huge dollar amount to be able to wire.
Yeah, and while I know we're not talking about instant payments, there's also the idea that we probably need some sort of a receiver validation side on the instant payment networks as well, because that will help increase the security of those transactions. So that could also impact activity from a wire front if there's now more security on the instant payment front. So the other thing to think about is our Niche U School of Daily Operations, which is really the foundation of our education. It's really where Niche started, was all these daily operational considerations. So we've broken out the Niche U School of Daily Operations this year into two different tracks. We have a beginner track and an advanced track. Both tracks together are the culmination of all things operations. So you start out with some of the more basic things in beginner, although I wouldn't even consider those to truly be basic. Some of them are pretty complex, but a lot of the receiving side of functionalities in the different payment networks, some of the exception processes associated with that, some of the risks associated with our payment channels, and a lot of the things that we've talked about in today's conversation. With our School of Daily Operations Advanced track, we build on that knowledge. So once we get you a core knowledge to begin with, we're able to build upon that and give you some of the much more advanced topics, the things that go awry that you need to consider. The sending side of things, when we think of origination from the ACH perspective, that tends to be very complex with third party senders and third party service providers and nested third party senders. So we really try to give a good foundation into all these different payment mechanisms to help our learners really work through the different operational considerations that they're dealing with from a day to day perspective. So, the other thing to think about is that we do offer the School of General Payments, which is really the starting point for all of our NICHU education. And in there, we have a lot of the foundational pieces that if you're really new to payments or you want a refresher, you're able to get a better understanding of the participants, the flow of transactions, and then the regulatory frameworks that are in place. That's a great way to get started, especially with the School of Daily Operations, because now you have a good foundation to build off of. You'll understand some of the more basic terms that are necessary when you're really going through this whole world of payments. Payments is pretty complex. The idea of the School of General Payments is that it's a free member benefit. So you don't have to pay anything extra. All you have to be is a niche member, and that really gets you started with the foundation of NICHU.